Okay, all right, we're back here for the third and final section of our class here, the Church in World History. So we're picking up, we just went through the Italian Renaissance is going on. So this is I would say this is the external, what do we call it? The external pressure on the worldly church. You know, the worldly church is starting to feel the external pressure. The freedom of expression that's starting to happen. I'm sure there's also there's writings that are going on, there's painting that's going on, and there's also students studying the Bible. Finally, these geniuses, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, and then, so that's the external pressure. In the middle, there's this, at 1302, this is really a hallmark in the Roman Church, because it's at this point when there was this absolute claim to the Pope's supreme authority. Basically, if you weren't in the Pope's church, you could not go to heaven. That was a declaration, and that was, they had been steadily increasing their power, and now it was going to be, declining. It was now going to be declining from that point on. The Black Plague took care of some of that. Now, the thing is, there's external pressure. The thing is, I don't want to assume that there weren't spiritual people inside the Roman structure, okay? So there were people on the inside. You had the external pressure of, the Black Death, the Renaissance thinking, the universities, the rise in scholasticism. That thing is starting to happen on the outside of the church. But on the inside of the church, you do have people who are concerned about its immoral, its immorality, its lack of spirituality, and, not everyone tried to exit the church, and it wasn't as simple as that. And really, if we look back to the Scriptures, we know that Paul's practice was to first go to the synagogue in any city that he went in. It was his practice. He would go to the synagogue, and that's where he would preach first. And if his message was refused in the synagogue, he would go to the Gentiles. But he really wanted to base, he really made his first approach. So I say this to say that God was really working inside the church too. Certain people's hearts were being stirred up. They're reading the Scriptures. They have the Latin Bible. They're reading it, and they're thinking about it. And so not everyone is following the idea that the Pope is in authority. And, so we had a number, so let's see, let's list some of these things. Let's see. So the Crusades were a disaster. Crusades, disaster. Plague, the Black Death. What do you call that? Disaster. What else could you call it? Disaster. So those are two things that are happening. You also have, let's see, what else? Then we have, the study, the schools. So we have the schools. That's not a disaster, but you have, thinking. You have skepticism. Skeptics are being developed, the schools and everything like that. And you have letters. You have the writing that's happening. Writing, and people are writing and reading. So people are starting to think for themselves. So now, so inside the church, we do have some people, Okay, let's talk about the Crusades. The Crusades, particularly led to, they were particularly directed against the Muslim holders of the territory. But in some people, it inspired, a missionary heart. And one of these persons was Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull. is his name. He was like one of the first. We tend to think like the missionary movement. I spell it right? I'm sorry, I spelled that wrong. Let me get that right there. Lull, William Raymond Lull. Now he was he was really a court. What's the best way to describe him? Ladies' man, gigolo. Just all around kind of loose guy, like really looking for any woman that he could, really, sin with, really. Player. I guess that's the name today, right? Player. I don't know whatever you want to call him. He was not a nice guy. He was not a church man at all. He was really just a bar cruiser, real bar hopper, looking for a woman who was drunk and that he could take home with him. I don't know what you want to call him, what he was. All right, I'm just going to say he met a woman. Okay, he met a woman, and this is the way the story goes with him. Okay, he met a woman in one of his drinking binges, and she was not interested in him, but he propositioned her anyway. To which point that she showed a part of her body that had been eaten away by cancer. So she she exposed herself, but she had had breast cancer. So when he saw that thing sobered him up right away, and that's the way his story goes. In that flash, he saw the emptiness in his lust patterns, and he dedicated himself to being a servant of God. So God got a hold of a real heathen here, and turned him in, that kind of thing. He was from Spain, Majorca, Spain, and this part of Spain was Catholic, but also at this point ruled pretty much by the Muslims. Now he said this, he was about 30. He wrote love songs, he sang love songs, he was a seducer. But at age 30, he said this, he wrote this little poem, "But Jesus Christ of his great clemency 5 times upon the cross appeared to me, that I might think upon him lovingly and cause his name proclaimed abroad to be." So Jesus Christ, in his great clemency, 5 times upon the cross appeared to me, that I might think upon him lovingly and cause his name proclaimed abroad to be. So he dedicated himself to Muslim missions, really, Muslim missions. He started to study. He studied the Jewish scriptures. He studied the Quran, and the Sufis, which are Islamic mystics, their writings. And he had a passion to win Muslims to Christ. And he traveled in that north part of Africa, spreading the message of the gospel. But the first crusade had failed. He went across Europe, crisscrossing, talking to kings and others, and popes and cardinals, trying to convince them that they should, evangelize Islam. Missionaries will convert the world by preaching, but also through their shedding of tears and blood with great labor, and through a bitter death, he said. His 3-point plan was very simple. Missionaries must obtain a comprehensive knowledge of Arabic and other languages, and then they must study Islamic literature so they could refute any Muslim argument, and then they must give their lives to witness for Christ. And he convinced the Pope to allow Christian universities to teach the Jewish and Islamic literature and languages. So he followed this plan, and he did this, and he won several imams, Muslim teachers. He won several Muslim teachers to be baptized, and he was imprisoned a couple times, and then the third time he was imprisoned twice, and the third time he was imprisoned and stoned and put on a boat and sent back to Spain, and he died on his way back to Spain on that. But in 1314. He died in 1314 was when he died. But in his 80s, though, in his 80s. So for 50 years of witness to the Muslims, to the Muslims. So that was his testimony there. So he had a great life. So this is somebody that was understood the church, was inside the church, really wasn't living by the church's, commands, but really tried to convince the church of the error of its ways. Another couple people, there was a woman, Catherine of Siena. Catherine also, she was, she and another man, a man Bonaventure, they actually call him Saint Bonaventure, but Bonaventure or Bonaventura, which is the Italian spelling. But Catherine of Siena, now the thing is, you got to remember, these people have no teaching, but Catherine of Siena had a great dream about, being married to Christ. And so she had a marriage to Christ, and she spent her life serving others. And really, during some of the troubles, she tried to counsel religious leaders. Bonaventure was, both of them really were teaching, the mystical, which is like a mystical apprehension of Christ, a mystical experience with Christ beyond the form. Like the form and the function and the ritual had taken its toll on these people, and these people were really looking for a different kind of relationship with God, and they were expressing it to people inside the church. And love supersedes knowledge. It was a Christ-centered. Bonaventure in particular had a very Christ-centered teaching, inside there, and he taught men to conform their lives to the life of Christ. So he was one of the primary doctors of the church during his lifetime. Now at this time, 46 generations after Christ, around AD 1400, around this time, only 27% of the world had been evangelized at this time. And the scriptures were, in different languages, bits and pieces of it. And but these people were, inside the church trying to do a work. Now, we talked about the universities. The University of Salerno, the University of Oxford is now important because from Oxford will come John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe this is a real turning point. He's from Oxford. We should start a new page for him. So we'll move on. He's from Oxford. John Wycliffe is studying at Oxford. He's learning the languages, and he begins to copy the Bible into the English language. Writing it out because he has a name. He's at Oxford. He has a name. He's called the Morning Star of the Reformation. So the Morning Star. He's like a very early figure. The Morning Star of the Reformation. He's so his first thing is to English scriptures. Now in England, his desire was that the plowboy would be able to read the Bible the way that the priest could. So, let me see here. Okay, so he was 1320 is when he was born, and he lived he lived about 60 years. 1320 to 1384 is when John Wycliffe was alive. He became very, after reading the scripture, he became very clear, very convinced about the Pope's claim of absolute authority. And being the voice of Peter in this present in the present world that Wycliffe was living in. And he talked to the faculty and he wrote scholarly articles in Latin condemning the Roman supremacy and the worldliness of the medieval church and other false teaching. And so he started to write, the scriptures in English and pamphlets in English. But he said ordinary people. It took him, and just 2 years before he died, 1382, was when the full Bible in English was finally available. So this marks the first time that the full Bible is available in English. Full Bible in English. Written by hand, translated by hand, scribbled out, best they can. He employed followers to copy out the translation, and the printing press hadn't been invented yet. So that's the end of our class tonight, is the printing press coming on. But he wanted everyone to be able to read these Bibles. He gave great support, and he developed a group of people called the Lollards. These were preachers, wandering preachers. They would walk around, they had the Bible, and they would preach. They would walk with the Bible and preach. Walk with the Bible and preach. They were the predecessors of the Shibellis and the Shallers. They would walk with the Bible and preach. That's the way they did it. They were, and the thing is that, Lollards, or what's the real name? Poor preachers. That's what that's really what the name means. Poor preachers. Because they dressed normally. They didn't dress in robes and wear, the tall kind of hats and carry like golden scepters and things like that around like the other, like the clerics, the Roman priests did. No, they walked around in regular clothes with the Bible, preaching the Bible. And so these were really the first group of, Methodists maybe, They were like, itinerant preachers walking from house to house, from corner to corner, speaking the Bible. Now this is, here's a picture. Here we see, this is an important picture here of, this is John Wycliffe here. And we see this is what's the important thing about all of his Lollards? There's a book, there's a book, there's a book, there's a book, there's a book. They got the Bible under their arms. So history is about to change because, John Wycliffe has given men the Bible. And this, he created a school that's not like that was sort of ordered on a monasterial kind of way, like a monk's kind of setup. And he would teach them from the Bible, and he would teach them preaching methods and everything like that. And he would send them out to preach and teach like that, dressed like normal people with the Bible in their hands. So this is a big thing for us. And you remember what's going on at this time. Okay, Wycliffe lives in the age of the Black Plague. He lives in the age of the Roman Church falling apart. He lives in the age when scholarship and letters and people are skeptical about what the Roman Church is teaching. Now they can open the Bible up and see if what the priest says is so. Like the Bereans did in Acts 17. They can behave that way. So this marks a significant turning point. This man is really, if you want to, talk about who's really important in church history, this is one of the big ones. John Wycliffe is one of the big ones, and we still have a group that carries his name, the Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they still search out tribal languages and try to translate the scriptures into those languages. And they go all around the world looking for a way, looking for places, looking for tribes that don't have a written language, and they make a translation of the Bible into that written language, and they teach those people to read and write. And there are still some of those tribes lingering in the jungles and of the Caribbean or the Amazon, and also Indonesia, the islands, and I'm sure in some of the African territories, they are still finding these little tribes of people that have lived, separated from the rest of reality, and they don't have a real written language. And so Wycliffe Bible Translators does this. So, so he cared deeply for the poor. This is another thing. And he railed against the abuses of the church. And soon he was deserted and persecuted, and he was sent off. He was sent out of England to live in, to live in Europe. He was sent away from England to live in Europe, and he died of a stroke on New Year's Eve in 1384. But a couple years later, the church could never really get over his problem. Okay, this is a etching here. This is the church officials here, and this is in Germany, Lutterworth, Germany. The Catholic officials found the body of John Wycliffe, several years later after he was dead, dug up his bones, burned them, and then poured the ashes into the river. So they weren't going, like that, like it really hurt him. I just show you that just to show the stupidity and the rage, the dying. Let's see. They wanted to, they crowded into his room. They hoped that he would, he would recant all of the things that he said against the Pope and everything like that. But he never did. He never did recant his, his stand. And people now had the Bible. They tried to get the Bible out of, they tried to get these copies of the Bibles back, but they could not. It was too late. It was out there. The Scriptures were out there, and this is all they could do to him, was dig up his bones, burn the bones again, and dump them into the river. At the rapture, that's going to be really amazing to see John Wycliffe's body all come together like that. This is my glorified body. Look at that. Can you believe they paid so much attention to this? Out of the river, wherever it's gone, is who knows? Anyway, but that's but his life was a most important life for us, just because of his dedication to the Scriptures, his dedication to these, to the things that God had given him to do, and led him in these things. So he's from Oxford. So we had the, so now his influence, would also go to Prague, University of Prague, and at the University of Prague was John Huss. And this is where our next story, John Huss, is the next. He was reading the what is it? He was reading the what is it? Reading the the things of Wycliffe and everything, and preparing his own heart for reading the writings of Wycliffe, understanding the Scriptures, and began to accept some of the things, the idea that salvation was not something that was only based upon the sacraments of the church. He was a son of peasants. Now, he lived in 1369 to 1415. He lived inside in Bohemia, which now the Czech Republic, and he studied philosophy, and he studied theology at the University of Prague, and his last name means goose, and this is where we get another one of our phrases: "We'll cook his goose." Last week we talked about raining cats and dogs, right? Like they'd pile up the dogs and cats that were dead from the Black Plague, and when it rained, it washed them all down into the river. Well, this is they'll cook his goose. This was what the Catholic Council said about John Huss. His preaching was powerful. In his churches, he preached at this Bethlehem chapel, and the crowds came to hear him because, the common people hear you gladly when you speak the gospel. And so, cook his goose, this is really a testimony to the way he died. He was burned at the stake. But the Bethlehem Chapel really illustrated his teachings. On his, the challenge to the Pope was the thing. The challenge to the Pope's authority was the thing of Wycliffe and John Huss. And the authorities in this remnants of the Holy Roman Empire was, the rise of the nation states has not really come to like a full thing. England had already sort of declared itself independent, but still, like certain leaders were dependent on Rome for staying in authority. So in Bohemia, because it was like one of the remnants of that Holy Roman Empire and the German influence there, the leaders there, still took their orders from Rome. And when John Huss was challenging the leaders of Rome with these pictures on his wall, he would show the Pope on a horse and Christ walking barefoot, just to show the just to show the contrast between the life of the Pope, who was living high in the saddle and riding like that, and Jesus Christ walking among the poor. So these kind of things, and he lifted the biblical preaching. Biblical preaching became the primary thing in his Mass. He'd do all the sacraments, but then instead of like the little short homily, he would give like a real Bible message in his Mass. And so people, were drawn to him. And they asked him to stop him preaching. They asked the authorities in his area to stop his preaching and also to burn the copies of the scriptures that he had gotten from Wycliffe. And the archbishop in the area condemned him. And he was summoned to a special council. He was summoned to a special council, and he was promised protection. He was promised protection by the authorities in Bohemia, but instead he was captured and brought before trial, made to wear a strange hat, and condemned. He was handed over to the secular authorities on July 6th, 1415. But he said he would gladly die. He would not trade his understanding of the Scriptures for a chapel full of gold. He said, I will not trade, my understanding of the Scriptures for a chapel full of gold. And so they purposed to cook his goose. And this is a picture in Prague of him. Now there's many pictures of him being led to the stakes. Here is John Huss. Here there's like hundreds of pictures of this act of taking John Huss. You could see, all of the people and the number of soldiers for this one man. It's sort of like, this like Christ. We see this picture. And it's really shown in several of the pictures this way. Here we see it again. John Huss being led. Here's the stake up here. And he's being led along by many soldiers. And they're bringing the sticks that they will use to burn him. And this is another one. Here's another picture of that, him. But he sang a psalm as he was burned. It's really described very well in Fox's Book of Martyrs. He sang a song as he was burned at the stake there for his faith. But his death only increased his prestige, and his death had a great effect on what would become of the Lutheran movement within 100 years. The Lutheran movement would move, but they still have this. This is John Huss's statue, still in the middle of Prague. They still celebrate his stand for truth. His stand for truth there. Okay, so one last person we want to think about is another person who was close to Rome, and his name is Savonarola. And let me spell this right. This would be the last person we talk about tonight, Savonarola, and then he was in Florence, around 14. So John Huss is doing this in the north, in Florence, in about 1450s, in 1452. He exposed the hypocrisy that was in the Roman Church. He had a passionate preaching style, and he made powerful predictions about what God was doing to the world because of the sins of the church. He said that his thing was that he was challenging a particularly immoral pope at that time, and they tried desperately to shut him up. He lived in Florence, which is the center. Again, Florence is the center of the banking and commerce. It has it has a significant. Let's see. It has a significant place in. Let's see. It has a significant. Where are we? Let's get the right one. Florence, up in here, up in this part of Italy, up in this northern part of Italy. Florence had a significant place in the commercial center, and so his messages were getting out and spreading, throughout all of Italy. So the word of God is coming, and they were spirited. What happened in Florence? It's amazing. They had lots of money, they had lots of art, and then revival. The arts, the commerce, and then the preaching of Savonarola brought this revival to Florence. And you'd think that the authorities in the church were happy about that. It'd be a Bible morality. People made him people made him sort of the mayor of Florence, because every decision that was taken in the city was brought before this. What did we say about when the righteous are in authority? What happens? The city is exalted. So the city saw a key to its prosperity in the preaching of this Roman Catholic, man who really was dedicated to the Scriptures, and he brought. They began to reform certain things. Prostitution, gambling, pornographic pictures, and other corrupting influences were being sort of swept out of Florence at that time because of his preaching. But Pope Alexander VI, who was immoral and ruthless, crushed him. He tried to bribe him first. Stop preaching so much. I'll give you more money. Let me give you some more money, and you can stop preaching. He was one of the reasons they started the Inquisition. Really started to exercise the Inquisition. They found him, and he was burned. He was hanged first, and then burned at the stake when he would not recant any of his challenges to the authority. In the face of death, this is what he prayed: "O Lord, 1,000 times you have wiped out my iniquity. I do not rely on my own justification, but on your mercy." And in between the tortures that he had to suffer, he wrote meditations on Psalm 32, which is the sin, which is David talking about the dry period of his sin, how he dried his bones, in Psalm 51, which is where David said, "Oh, have mercy on me, O Lord." And Martin Luther later published these meditations, and they were calling them, Martin Luther called them a great piece of evangelical and Christian piety. So he was hanged in 1498. Savonarola was hanged and burned at the stake, and the bishop stripped him of his priestly garb, and he said, "I separate you," the Pope said, "I separate you from the church militant and from the church triumphant." And Savonarola replied before he died, before they dropped him through the boards and hung him, he said to the Pope, "That is beyond your power." So we see that people inside the Catholic Church were trying to change things. Okay, the last person that needs to be spoken about is Gutenberg. And why is he important? Why, he's not a church man. He invented the movable type printing press. Invented the printing press. And he invented it because he had a vision. Inventing the printing press. Okay, Chinese had invented, a printing press, but primarily Chinese has like many characters, and you just tell the story with the character. English and these languages were not really the same kind of languages, but movable type, with movable type, the movable type, you could arrange a page and then print it, and then use the same letters to arrange another page and print it, and then press it. So the printing press, let's see, what was he? Okay. Printing came when the world would have the most need of it. It came in 1440. 1440 was when he invented the printing press. And in a season when the great mass of people could not read up to that point. But with the Reformation and things happening, reading would become like a primary tool for the spread of the gospel. Gutenberg said this. He said the reason he invented the printing press, God suffers because there are such multitude of souls to whom his sacred word cannot be given. God suffers because there are a multitude of souls to whom his sacred word cannot be given. And he stated this also. He said, religious truth is captive in a small number of little manuscripts, which guard the common treasures instead of expanding them. Let us break the seal that binds these holy things, and let us give wings to truth that it may fly with the word. No longer prepared at vast expense, but multitudes everlastingly by a machine which never goes tired, to every soul which enters life. Religious truth was captured in little manuscripts, but he invented, and the first thing he produced was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, 1456. The modern age, this is the demarcation of the modern age. By 1500, there were 9 million books in Europe. How long is that? That's the spread, okay? 1440, it's invented. 1456 is the first Bible. By 1500, there are 9 million books. 9 million books. Before that, there was just a few thousand manuscripts, but now 9 million books in Europe. And books were cheaper and easier to produce, and they could produce as many as they want without rewriting them, recopying them. And so Johann Gutenberg, a vision to win the lost with the printed word is another one of our here. So Wycliffe copied the Bible by hand. Gutenberg, printed the Bible by the printing press. And here we are today, holding it up here at the end of our church and world history class tonight. So Lord, we thank you for these men and their great convictions and their great authority that you gave them. Lord, in those days, great courage to stand up to the spirit of the age. May we have the same kind of courage in our own day. Guard us, protect us, keep us, lead us, and help us to recognize the great faith and spiritual power that you exercised throughout these days of history and that you still want to exercise in our days. In your name, amen. Okay, you're dismissed. Thank you very much. Have a great night.